Welcome everyone. In this lecture we'll be talking a little bit about quantitative research, or the use of numbers to describe phenomena in the world. The lecture will be broken up into three parts. In the first part we'll talk about quantitative research generally. In the second part we'll talk about experimental quantitative research. In the third part we'll talk about other types of quantitative research. Alright, so why would someone use a quantitative research approach? Well, there's a bunch of different reasons, but one of the main ones is that if you really want to make informed decisions about how to move forward with improving healthcare services, you very often need actual numbers to support arguments that we should do something one way or another. Alright, so let's illustrate this using an example. So imagine that you're a healthcare researcher and your specific interest is in health disparities. Now you know that people who live in low-income urban environments have less access to nutrient-dense foods. Now you're concerned that this may have an impact on health outcomes. Specifically, you're interested in studying whether or not this impacts the rate of obesity. So you set up a study that is going to address this question, and you're looking at comparing people who live in low-income urban environments to a control group. Now, part of the idea of doing this research to begin with is to have some impact on the healthcare system if there is in fact a problem. Now, we know that politicians and healthcare administrators really aren't likely to make a huge change in either the healthcare delivery system or in allocating public resources, public financial resources, unless there's really strong evidence showing that there's an impact here. And to do that, you need to disprove the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis here is that living in a low-income urban environment has no impact on levels of obesity. So as a researcher, you're wondering whether or not the research hypothesis is true, where you're actually going to try and show that perhaps people who live in a low-income urban environment are more likely to be affected, to have a higher body weight, and these are people who are indicated in yellow in this diagram, than people who are in the control group, indicated by people marked off as blue. So as a researcher, you can actually assign numbers to this, and you can say, well, this group is twice as high of a risk of developing obesity, or 3 times, or 4 times, some concrete number that indicates what the magnitude of the healthcare problem is. And this is really key information in getting the healthcare system to move and to make changes, because it tells you how big the problem is and how much we have to change things in order to appropriately address it. So this is one of the real virtues of quantitative research. It provides numbers and statistical evidence that you can't get from qualitative research. It says that this isn't just a matter of opinion. This is really strong, well-designed evidence suggesting that we have to make a real change in order to effectively serve the health needs of this population. So what are the general characteristics of quantitative research? Well, it tends to be more identified with what we think of more as the traditional scientific method, by which I mean it tries to gather data in an objective way to improve the rigor of the findings. It also generally is very systematic and takes a structured approach to gathering data. It does this because it tries to make that information more generalizable to other situations and populations, and to produce numerical data that really accurately represents the relationships of the variables being addressed. So what would you expect to be in a plan for quantitative research? Well, this is actually going to be similar to many of the elements that we've already discussed. So you would expect them to have a clear statement about what the purpose of the study, perhaps with hypotheses, for example. You would want to know where the study is being done, who the population is that's being addressed, what the types of data are that's going to be collected and how it's being collected, what the structure of that data collection process is, and generally how this whole process is designed to obtain rigorous and accurate data. Now, unlike qualitative research, where variables tend to be somewhat broader and very often have more of a conceptual nature, in order to do quantitative research, you have to have variables that can be operationalized. And this would be typically dependent variables, independent variables, and extraneous variables. So as a researcher, you would really want to collect data that would fill all these different roles. So the dependent variables, as we discussed previously, is really looking at the outcome of the study. And this usually is not something that's manipulated in the context of the study. The independent variable, again, is what we're looking at, what the experimental condition is that we're changing in the study. Sometimes you're changing it, sometimes it's just a factor of the environment. For example, the example I gave earlier where it's access to nutrient-dense foods. So you may not be manipulating that yourself as a researcher. Now, in these studies, it's pretty standard practice that you'd also collect a lot of other information that needs to be controlled, other factors that may affect the relationship between the dependent and independent variable. And this is done in order to be more confident about there being a statistically significant interaction between those two variables. And we'll discuss this in more detail at a later point. So in part 2 and 3 of this lecture, we're actually going to talk about a number of different research designs. But I just want to introduce the fact that there are a wide range of different ways that you can design a quantitative research study to address your questions. They vary considerably and in terms of the strength of the information that they get. But really, the approach that you adopt will really depend on a number of different things. The types of questions that you're asking. So, for example, if you're thinking about an environmental effect, you aren't going to randomize people to different environments. You can't do that. You have to study this in the actual environment itself. So you couldn't do a randomized control trial in the same way in that context. You also will want to think about the state of knowledge that you currently have about this particular area. You don't want to do a tremendously expensive randomized control trial that might cost $1 million when you don't even have any basic information suggesting that this even matters. And it also might depend on the theoretical base. Do we actually have theories in place that can help describe and explain why this might be something that you want to do? You might want to do some initial work to build those theories before you go on to other types of research approaches. Now, if you're a researcher trying to design a study that really produced rigorous information that could be useful in actual healthcare practice, there are a number of different factors that you would need to think about in your study design. So that would be objectivity, accuracy, feasibility, control, validity, both internal and external. So we're going to talk about those different elements in designing a study as we go through the next few slides. So as a researcher, it's your obligation to really engage with your topic in a way that indicates that you have an open mind to different possibilities, and also indicates that you've really taken the time to think through the many different possibilities for how this particular health phenomena could pan out in terms of the different variables that you're looking at. So that includes picking out a theoretical framework that really makes sense, and also having really spent the time to delve into the literature that's available on this topic to see what the evidence is to support or deny that there is some sort of impact there. And this should be done in a fair and even-handed way. And there are a number of different factors, some listed here, which you would expect to see pop up in this literature review as indicators of the different elements that a researcher would look at in terms of making these decisions about the topic that they would address in their study. So the accuracy of the study is also really important, and this is the extent to which the study is designed in a way that it can actually really address the question that's being asked. This is really accomplished by carefully applying the theories and the knowledge that one has obtained through the literature review. It's also worth noting that the level of accuracy really is not necessarily dependent on how complex or simple a design is. It's really trying to figure out what the best approach is to answer the problem that's been raised. Now, another factor to consider, as we've actually discussed previously, is the feasibility of a study. So it's not always possible to do all studies, even if they would be interesting or useful for the field. There are factors like actually being able to access people who have a certain health condition or certain types of equipment. It could be whether or not you actually have the ability to collect data, whether you have the time and resources are available, including money to do it. Also, whether you have the resources to and skill to analyze the data, and that relates to the experience of the researcher. And then there's also considerations around ethics. Is this something that we can really do? Whether or not it's an interesting question, is this something that's an appropriate research project to carry forward? In quantitative research, it's also really important to think about consistency within the study. And this can be thought of in terms of control, which is the idea that there would be uniformity across the different tested variables, and intervention fidelity, which is the idea that everybody within the study would receive similar types of treatment, and that this would be standardized. Now, this really needs to be thought about before the data in the study is actually collected so that this is done effectively. So there are a few different ways that a researcher could actually improve control in the study. One is by ensuring that their population that they're looking at is homogeneous, in the sense that they have similar impacts from, say, extraneous variables that may influence the connection between an independent variable and a dependent variable, such that, say, if your treatment group and your control group has different amounts of influence from extraneous variables, then it might throw off your results. They also need to think about their data collection procedures, such that everybody gets interacted with in the same way. They get recruited in the same way, for example, so that there is consistency in the data that would be collected, and there's consistency in the information that people receive before they decide whether or not to enter the study. So if during a consent session you talk to people differently who are in the experimental group and the control group, then you might actually have an impact on how their opinions on things, for example, later down the line. Another element is the idea of randomization. Randomization is really nice because it can help control for these extraneous variables, because people could wind up in either the experimental or the control group. You can also increase control by being able to manipulate the independent variable. Now, this isn't always possible. For example, you can't expose people to toxins versus not expose them to a toxin if you know that they're correct, because that wouldn't be, if you know that they're damaging, because you know that that's unethical. But you could do something, say a treatment intervention, where you're not sure if giving people an educational intervention will decrease them from smoking or not. Then you can either give it to them or not give it to them, and that would be an ethical manipulation of your independent variable. So these are a number of different ways that one can think about improving the likelihood that an independent variable actually predicts your dependent variable. So ideally, a quantitative research study would be unbiased, or in other words, it would be a valid study. So there are a number of different ways of thinking about validity, but I'm going to talk here about the internal validity of a study and the external validity of a study. Now, what is the internal validity study? Well, this is the extent to which the independent variable actually really makes a difference in the dependent variable, and that the study is designed in such a way so that you're confident that that your study measures what you thought it would measure. All right, so what are a number of things that might actually influence the connection between the independent variable and the dependent variable? Well, one of the first things would be history. And history is something that happens in the course of a study that may affect your data. So this would be an unexpected event. So say, for example, you're studying what people's opinions are about smoking in the context of whether they receive an educational intervention versus not having an educational intervention. And let's say that suddenly during the study, new documents come out indicating that a tobacco company lied about the impacts of smoking. And this is covered all over the news. Well, this could affect how participants in your study respond to this, and this difference may be influenced by whether someone actually went through that educational intervention or not. So this may influence the data obtained in your study and undermine the connection between the independent and dependent variable. So what is maturation? Maturation recognizes the fact that people actually change over time, especially young people. So let's look at an example of this. So say your study is looking at whether or not an anti-bullying campaign had influence on children in the high school. And you do a pre-test in 10th grade, and then you do your intervention, and then you do a test later on in 11th grade. Well, the problem here is that people actually mature a fair bit between 10th grade and 11th grade. And it might be entirely possible that they've just stopped adopting these bullying behaviors just because they've gotten older and better behaved. And it might have nothing to do at all with your anti-bullying campaign. Okay, so here's another way that your study could potentially be biased, and this is called testing. Now, testing is the idea that actually carrying out surveys in the context of study may actually affect how people respond to those surveys. So let's imagine that you're doing a diabetes education intervention. So at the beginning of the study, you do a survey which asks participants about their knowledge about insulin levels. So then you give them educational intervention, and then you 2 months later, you do a follow-up survey. Well, it could be that if there's a higher rate of knowledge about insulin levels at the end, that's because of your educational intervention. It could also be because when they did the survey itself, they said, "Oh, I actually don't know that." So they went home and they actually looked it up and they found out this information. And when they took the second test, they actually were able to tell you more about insulin levels, and that may be entirely unrelated to the intervention itself and may only be related to the fact that you actually did a survey asking them this specific question. Issues with instrumentation are also another potential problem for quantitative studies that are looking at a connection between an independent and dependent variable. Well, this is because you really need to make sure that the people who are collecting your data are collecting that information in a consistent way, and also that the actual instruments, the tools that you use, are accurate in terms of measuring the information you're looking at. So let's give an example of this. So say, for example, that you have people who are collecting data about their observations of people's hand washing, and they're going to rank that hand washing from 1 to 5. Well, what happens if the different data collectors actually have different opinions about what counts as good hand washing technique? Well, what can happen is if there's difference between an experimental and control group, or that it just doesn't reliably measure the phenomenon that you're looking at, you could actually have a weakening of the effect that you're trying to observe, and it could undermine the relationships with the independent and dependent variable. Another thing to think about in terms of studies is what's called attrition. So this is really addressing who actually drops out of a study. This is pretty common if you're looking at a group of people over time. It's pretty common that the people that you start out with will drop out. So they'll move and you won't be able to contact them. In many cases, when you're talking about diseases that are severe, they might die. Now the concern here is that if you're looking at characteristics of individuals or, say, opinions of individuals, what happens if the people that drop out over time are different than the people who stay in the study? So let's look at an example of this. So say that you're teaching breast exams to people, and you're going to follow up with them on the phone 1 year after doing this intervention. Well, what happens if the only people who are willing to complete the survey after a year and respond are the ones who are actually the most interested in breast cancer to begin with? Well, this might show that these people have a tremendous amount of interest in doing this and are very good about completing the exam regularly, etc. And this may suggest that you had a huge impact of your intervention, even though it's actually just a misleading effect, because the people who didn't adopt this change are just the people who didn't respond to your survey. So this can be a very big issue for studies. Another concern we're thinking about is the idea of selection bias. So the way that you actually get people into your study really matters. Your population, if you take certain approaches that really are only pulling in people who will give you certain types of answers, and especially if you don't recognize this can create misleading data. So, for example, say that you are trying to understand how parents influence childhood eating patterns. And the way that you advertise for your study is that you put up a poster and say, this is a study about the quality with which different parental behaviors influences how children eat food and the impact on health outcomes. Well, parents reading this already probably have opinions about whether they're doing this well or not. And it might very well be the case that the people who you get into this study are not representative of the overall population. They represent the parents who are either very concerned about their role in the eating of the child, or they think that they do a really good job, and this might mean that they actually do a better job. And what this may mean is that the results of your study may be influenced by the fact that you're not dealing with the population or as representative of a population as you think you are. So it's really important as you're reading a study to think a little bit about how these different processes where bias can be introduced into quantitative research may be actually present in the studies you're trying to assess for. So there's another way to think about validity. Now, internal validity, as I said, is really focused on the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. The other way to think about this is, to what extent is this study valid in terms of understanding the population that they want to address and understanding other broader populations? So, in other words, how well can we generalize these findings and use these findings in practice? Now, generally speaking, having good internal validity is going to help you with your external validity. But I say usually here because it doesn't always entirely help. In some senses, they can have counter purposes. So you can improve your internal validity by ensuring that you have a population in your study that has as few extraneous variables as possible. You can do that by ensuring that everybody in the study is pretty much identical to each other as much as possible. Same race, same age, same sex, same economic background, etc. But the problem is that when you do that, you potentially can focus in on a population that is, say, the most compliant with your study, the objectives of your study, so that they are the ones who will adopt the health behaviors you want. But when you actually apply this to a larger clinical population, which represents everybody, that the intervention that you designed actually is entirely ineffective. So the two are not necessarily related to one another. Unfortunately, in research, there has been a real emphasis on internal validity over external validity. And it's my personal opinion that we need to do more work to really try and do studies that really represent the environment of actual clinical experience, where we have a wide range of different people encountering a health condition or an intervention, and not exclusively focus on whether the study is as strong as possible in terms of internal validity. But I'll get off my soapbox. That is something that I tend to get concerned about. So what are some threats to external validity? Well, we've already talked about two of them. Those are selection effects and measurement effects. So selection effects are a problem if you select a biased sample. So say you're looking at parents who are only really interested in providing the best food for their children as opposed to a more general population of parents. This is a problem because if you have a biased sample, you can't really apply it in order to really understand what's going on with your larger population, or even to apply it to other populations. Measurement effects are also an issue. So if you're having an impact of these tests that you use in your intervention, when you actually take that intervention and use it in a population, a broader population that isn't getting these tests, then you may have an impact on whether or not it's really actually applicable to a larger population. The third point I want to make is the idea of the reactive effects, or what are also known as Hawthorne effects. And this is something that you see in many different types of studies, where people in the studies actually change their behaviors because they know that they're in a study and that they're being observed. So this was originally found in an electrical plant called the Hawthorne plant, where they were trying to see whether a number of different changes in that plant would influence work productivity. And what they found is no matter what they did in terms of the changes, there was always a positive influence on productivity. And they were trying to figure out why, because some of it didn't even make any sense. And they saw that it was because the people in the plant wanted it to work, and they were trying to make a change because they believed that this change that the researchers were doing were going to have a positive impact. And this is a general phenomenon where people tend to have a lot of trust in researchers, and they tend to think and want to please them. Now, so we do often see this, and it can be a particular problem if you treat an intervention population differently than your control population. You can sometimes have the people in their intervention be much more concerned about making the researcher happy and change their behavior a lot more, and that doesn't necessarily relate to the actual quality of the intervention that's being applied. So these are a number of different elements that one would think about in terms of validity. They're very common in research studies. The fact that a study may have some elements and some concerns related to this doesn't mean that it's a bad study. It just means that these are things that need to be considered in understanding the overall quality and understand the extent to which one can apply the findings that the researcher discovered.